Dexter. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the leader today, and I'm also on the Activities Committee, which is a very, very busy committee run by and chaired by our lovely Diana Sisley over there. And we bring you entertainment speakers, and we bring you entertainment for the evening programs. Today, I want you to get comfortable, hunker down in your chair, and I want you to think about, get your thinking caps on, because our speaker, Saki O'Sullivan, is going to be speaking about 10 questions. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read this because he's got a lot of titles and I don't want to miss anything. 10 questions. How do great writers like Jane Austen, William Shakespeare, and I just found out another author that Saki likes, Albert Camus. I just finished reading his book. How, anyway, these great writers and literature help us to understand, appreciate, and transform our lives. So that's what you're going to be thinking about when Saki gets up to speak. And we also have his lovely bride over there, Susan. Now, before I let you have Saki at the podium, I want to tell you just a little bit about this man. He wasn't always a professor. He's a retired professor now, but that does not mean that he is not working. He is vice president of the ESU, and he is president-elect of the Florida Historic Society. But in his younger days, oh, Saki, I am going to tell that. For those of you who haven't read the newsletter, Saki was born in New Jersey, and he kind of was a rascal when he was younger. He, in his younger life, he was a teamster, a jail guard, and he was an Irish pub owner. And I got that information from his lovely, sweet wife. And so now please put your hands together and help me welcome Saki.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much.
You are welcome.
And I'd like to thank Manuel. We had a major issue with the PowerPoint. We're going to see how that works and where we can go with that. But I'd like to say how good it is to see so many people out and about. Even Frank Barber. I came to understand recently why I have always been fascinated with bears as I came out of hibernation. So I brought one of my pets here so that he could join us. And today, I am extraordinarily impressed at the number of males who, after 15 months of talking to people on Zoom, kept their long pants. I was not expecting that. I wasn't really ready for that. So I should give you a little background on this. I retired in May of 2020, a little over a year ago, and I had my entire retirement planned out beautifully. Susie had us scheduled for a bunch of trips, and I was scheduled to rotate in as president of two organizations that I really admire, ESU and the Florida Historical Society. And so my future was nicely planned out, and then everything collapsed. At that point, retired, I obviously didn't have the structured classes to go back to. I did what anyone with my heritage would do. I took a little time to feel sorry for myself. And you probably all know that self-pity and melancholy are built into the Irish DNA. You can't be Irish without a lot of experience with that. My wife is not Irish and was not having any part of it. And so she decided I needed to get going on something. I needed to find a project. So I began realizing that this, as a chapter in my life, is supposed to be the best chapter, the best act. After we leave work, as my friend Marvin Newman always says, the last chapter of any great mystery explains the mystery. The last act of any Shakespearean play unfolds everything. And the last movement of any symphony should be the greatest movement. So we should be looking forward to this. And I sat in my little office saying, okay, I need to be looking forward to this. So, first thing I did is pull out a chart that I use with my students. And this is a meta-study of the age that we peak at everything. And of course, you can't see the ages for most of them on it. But if you notice, after 7, learning a new language will be a challenge, as I think all of us understand and learned along the way. And unfortunately, the average age for winning a Nobel Prize is 40. And I think except for David, all the rest of us have passed that. On the other hand, and I use this with my students to show them that they're a little too arrogant. They really think they are at the peak of everything, and they're not nearly at the peak of things. For example, it won't be until 71 that the average person achieves the peak of his or her vocabulary. And it's not till 74 that we actually can look in a mirror and feel good about ourselves. And one of the truly wonderful things, it's at 82 that we reach the height of our psychological well-being. All of this to me is really encouraging. So I thought, what am I going to work on? And I realized that what I loved at school, teaching literature, was not the grading. I think any teachers understand that. Not most of the meetings. Not most of my interactions with our administrators. I remember recently a meeting with the dean who called me up and asked me to come to her office. I got there, and she told me that a student had complained that I failed her on an exam. And I said, well, she didn't show up for the exam. And the dean said, well, exams frustrate her. Can't you do something about that? Can't you be understanding? And I thought for a while and said, okay, grading frustrates me. Can you be understanding if I decide not to grade anymore? And of course, she didn't want to talk to me much anymore, which is the point where she joined most administrators at Rollins. So I do remember, however, the classes where we were talking about subjects, and especially a goal I had, which was to have students understand that we are not oracles. We do not have the answers. We have questions. And the whole point of our conversations was to help them ask themselves better questions. Questions are the point of maturity. That's where we actually realize that we're adults. We start understanding questions. And I tried to illustrate that point to them. And of course, this is the thinking process. And rather than use Rodin and the thinker, I prefer the statue in front of the Academy at Athens, statue of Socrates, for pretty obvious reasons. Students tend to think of themselves like those cars that fall into a pond or into a lake. And we are not the tow trucks, but we're the crane trucks, right? And our goal is to pull them out. I think our job as teachers is to show them that we're going to be in the same place as they are. And what we have to try and do is come up with better questions, better cranes. But of course, that doesn't always work. And finally, we'll get to a question that everybody has some sense of satisfaction with. So, the questions I decided to look at were, first of all, 5 fairly philosophical ones. And then, I'm sorry, 5 fairly practical ones, pragmatic ones, and then 5 philosophical ones. Incidentally, as part of my pedagogical belief, there is on these slides a typo. And there is a reward, a cash reward, for the first person who sees the typo and puts his hand up. And it's not just a cash reward, it is $100 trillion. Of course, it's on the Bank of Zimbabwe, but it is a beautiful note, beautifully printed note. It's worth about maybe a tenth of a penny. But in aesthetics, it's worth obviously far more than that. So this is Domenico Zampieri, The Rebuke of Adam and Eve. The first question, of course, has to be the primal question, the very first question that occurs in the Judeo-Christian tradition, at least. And here, God is chastising Adam and Eve. And if you notice down the right-hand corner, you have the lion lying down with the lamb. Remember Isaiah said the lion shall lie down with the lamb. But then Woody Allen said, yeah, but the lamb ain't gonna get a lot of sleep. So we all know this story. Genesis has 2 creation stories. First chapter is that wonderfully broad, idealized version of creation where God makes man and woman simultaneously. And he gives them only 2 rules. The first is make lots of babies, be fruitful and multiply. And the second is you're boss, you're in charge of things. My male students love that. Of course, they don't like the baby part, but they like the sex part. There's lots of sex, and you're in charge of everything for it. And then we go to the second chapter, which begins the second creation story, which is much more detailed and much more involved with limits. Adam and Eve have names. God creates them. He gives them more specific rules. Adam is supposed to work in the garden. He is supposed to cultivate it. And they are not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think we all know that. And we all know that in the Middle Ages in Europe, that fruit was interpreted as apples, because apples make for nice, colorful images to put out there. Jewish scholars often talk about things like pomegranates, things you would be much more likely to find in the Middle East than apples. But we still think of apples in the part of the story. And Adam listens to that injunction, and he seems perfectly happy, right? Most of us guys are, just to go out and do his job. Eve, on the other hand, is sitting at home, and you know what's going through her mind. Apple pie, apple turnover, apple fritters, candied apples. Eve is the curious one. And along comes the 4th player in this, the serpent. And the serpent, and we have to think of the serpent really as the traveling salesman in those 1930s and 40s movies, going up to the farm girl. He goes up to Eve and seduces her and tells her, what are you doing? And she said, well, we can do all this. And he said, what about that nice fruit? She said, well, we can't eat that. He said, why not? God said, on the day you eat this fruit, you shall surely die. And the serpent says, no, you're not going to die. If you eat that fruit, you're going to know good and evil. You're going to be more like God. Eve thinks that's a good idea. She eats the fruit, Adam comes home, she gets him to eat the fruit, and then they decide they better hide because they know God likes strolling in the garden. And so when God comes down and strolls in the garden, he says, "Where are you?" And I have to admit, this was my first theological crisis. When I was in elementary school in Jersey City, St. Al's, I told Sister Mary Malachi that I didn't understand that. My favorite show was Superman with George Reeves. And he had X-ray vision. Why didn't God have X-ray vision? There's got to be something wrong with a God who doesn't have X-ray vision. So, of course, my father got a call, and he came down, and he had to act as though he was unhappy with me. And he took me home and told me he was proud of me. He said, "But you can't say things like that to nuns." So we got along much better after that, my father. But I had trouble with that for a long time until I started thinking a little more carefully about the story and realized this is not a GPS question. It's not where are you physically. It's where are you now that you've disobeyed me emotionally, psychologically, morally. Where are you in your relationship with each other? And I thought, that's a great question. Where are you? I often start classes off by using a version of that story and tell the students, by the end of this class, you should have some idea of where you are. And as you think about where you are, especially for me at that point, a year ago or so, I had to think of where I was psychologically, emotionally, morally, physically, and financially. And luckily, financially, we were in good shape. And once you decide that there's some things you're not especially crazy about, then you start thinking of how do I change that? What do I do to change that? For anybody in here, incidentally, who is perfectly happy with all aspects of your life, you can tune out until the last 5 questions, the philosophical questions on it. So, if we're not fine, where should we go? And my question for that comes from Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. If you remember the story of Waiting for Godot, it has 2 hobos, comic figures, 2 characters that no one's really been able to define perfectly, who are waiting for a character named Godot. And by now everybody knows Godot's not coming. And it has 2 acts, and Godot comes in neither of them. And one of the things Vladimir asks Estragon, and Estragon asks Vladimir, is, shall we go? And of course, they never go. They sit there talking about, when shall we go? How shall we go? And they sit there waiting for Godot, who's not going to come. When this play first was staged, it was enormously unpopular. Its first production in the United States was down in South Florida at the Coconut Grove Playhouse. Some of you have probably been there. Wonderful. I think it's closed now, isn't it? But a wonderful place. The audience had people like Tennessee Williams in it. But still, half the audience walked out on the play. They hated it. Nobody could understand it. There was one group that understood it and for whom it was enormously popular. Inmates. Soon after its first production, inmates began asking Beckett if they could produce it in their prisons and jails. And he was completely supportive of it. And they put on productions. There have been productions in Florida prisons, prisons throughout the United States, throughout Europe. It's mostly because inmates understand waiting for something. that may or may not ever come. And they understand planning. One of the things I found when I'd have discussions with inmates, I worked what was called the third shift from 8 at night till 6 in the morning. And I had to deal with the people who were insomniacs. And they would be up and they'd want to talk. And it was, hey, college boy. You know, I'd go over and we'd chat about things. And they all had these enormously detailed plans of what they were going to do. And as I think we all know, very few inmates ever do those things. In the United States, we have an 83% recidivism rate, people returning, because they get out. And occasionally, I would run into inmates when I was in a restaurant or when I was in a bar, people who had been inmates when I was a guard, and we'd start talking, and I'd say, oh, remember you were planning to go back to school and get your GED? And they say, well, yeah, I'm going to do that someday. Let me buy you a drink. Yeah, and clearly that day was going to come just after Godot arrived on it. Now, Beckett, who is somebody I really like, was also one of life's ultimate downers, if you really look at him. But if you look carefully at what he's saying, I think there's a lot of encouragement. And one of his best sayings, 5 short sentences that I find brilliant, I tried to teach my sons, sums up a lot of the truth about life. And I put it on many of my syllabi. I think it was on one of David's. Try, fail, try again, fail again, but fail better. I tell my students, if you fail better each time you try, you are succeeding at a lot. I'm not sure how many of them believe me. It's amazing what students will put up with. You know, we train them so well in elementary school to just sit there and accept anything we say that trying to get them to question and challenge is, I think, the hardest thing to do in the academic world. The next question, after we talk about shall we go, is why do so many people not go? And this is a Greek image of Oedipus and the Sphinx. Remember, it was the Sphinx who brought the plague upon the land, and Oedipus had to try and find the answer to the question of who had murdered the previous king. And we all know it was he on that. And so the key for not acting is generally fear. It's fear of the unknown. All those could have beens, might have been, should have beens, don't occur because we hesitate. We're afraid of it. And the strange thing about fear is that we're born with an instinct for fear, but we're only born with 2 innate fears. The fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. Every other fear we have is learned. And so one of the things classic writers always do is explore why we fear the future, why we fear the unknown. Jocasta, Oedipus' wife, says, in talking to Tiresias, why should a man whose life seems ruled by chance live in fear? A man who never looks ahead, who has no certain vision of his future. And naturally, since you can always find a line in Shakespeare that echoes whatever it is you want to say, Julius Caesar says it when his wife tries to stop him from going to the forum. Cowards die many times before their death. The valiant never taste death but once. Of all the wonders that I yet have heard, it seems to me most strange that men should fear seeing their death necessarily end up coming.
Tom doesn't have an earring. Can I have the money?
What?
The last word doesn't have an earring.
Whoa! Okay, that wasn't the typo I thought. Okay. You caught the first one.
The first one was the
You caught the
clothing
unintentional one. So you're now $100 trillion richer.
But there was a typo on the last slide.
And did you have your hand up?
Oh, I'm too shy. Way to go, girl.
So there are more than one typo. And the whole issue of fear, and I'm going to get a long memo from Perry when I now say something scientific about this. We know it's really that battle between the amygdala, that little almond-shaped part of our brain that is the source of the fight or flight, that we respond to things. And that develops very, very quickly. It's also much larger in males than in females. And the prefrontal cortex is a much slower developing part of the brain that has us put some brakes on the amygdala. So when you're driving down I-4 and somebody cuts you off, your amygdala shoots in and you start thinking, do I ram him? All the guys in here understand this. And then the prefrontal cortex says, this is Orlando. He's probably got an Uzi. Don't ram him. Don't ram him. That's not a smart thing to do. So it's a battle between the two. And then in women, the prefrontal cortex is pretty well developed by 22. With men, it's about 25. And this is one of the reasons why car rental agencies don't want to rent to younger people, why insurance is so bad for youngsters, especially young males, and why young males do such dumb things. They've got that amygdala. And it makes sense that our fight or flight instinct would kick in first, because when that group of Neanderthals shows up in your cavern, you don't want to sit there and think, can I negotiate with them? You want to deal with them. When you're being attacked by an animal, you don't want to think about that. So we need to have those defense mechanisms. It's only later on that we can develop the rest of this. There are two other factors that I think come in besides fear. One is tolerance for risk. Not quite sure that's different from fear, but how much tolerance do we have for risk? And we know some of our friends have a lot of tolerance for risk. I know at retirement, when I sat down with a financial advisor, that's all he wanted to talk about, my tolerance for risk. And I thought it was really high until I answered all his questions. Now I'm going to get falling down the scale from it. And the third is what I call avoidance. And avoidance is when we just don't want to deal with what's in front of us. In fact, recently you may have seen the study that two Harvard psychologists published, which showed that the average person is not paying attention to what he or she is doing 46.9% of the time. Okay. Which means half of you are thinking about dinner or Netflix, right? We don't think about what we're doing. Our mind's wandering somewhere else. And it also allows us to avoid having to deal with a lot of these issues. If we give in to fear, the most logical thing for us to do is to rationalize. We can also try and distract ourselves. Would it have been worth it? Would it have been worth it? And if you know one of my favorite poems, T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, just says, pretentious name of the protagonist suggests. Prufrock is at a party, some type of cocktail party, tea party, wants to ask a woman to go away with him, and tries to build up his nerve, never does. And when he realizes he will not ask her, he decides, would it have been worth it after all? It wouldn't have been worth it. And it's a 1916 poem. Eliot was showing what he thought about society on the verge of World War I. At the end of the 19th century, he, like many of the young writers, saw society as empty, as tired, as worn out. So we also have a lot of ways of rationalizing self-pity and fear. Self-pity and melancholy are two of the obvious ways we deal with problems, with trying to justify for ourselves. And I think the first citation of this that I came across was in the Odyssey. If you remember when Achilles has his lover Briseis taken away from him by Agamemnon, he tells the Greeks, the Achaeans, he will not fight. And he goes down to the shore and sits and sulks. And Homer writes, and to me this was a brilliant insight, he taught me a lot about myself. Sweeter than dripping honey is it to sit by the big black ships and sulk. As you think about that, there's an enormous amount of pleasure in feeling sorry for yourself. Some of us engage in that and get more pleasure from it than other people do. We also often turn to things like sad stories and the blues. And biologists tell us that those release endorphins. And the endorphins can work as analgesics. If you're feeling bad about yourself, the best thing to do is get out a tearjerker and put it on television. And then your endorphins kick in, and we feel bad about the people who are there, we connect with them. It's a wonderfully self-indulgent way to deal with that. It also, for many people, is a way of feeling that they have a connection with others, that they are empathetic people. And I believe it's also a way we have of thinking of ourselves as good people. Because if we feel sorry for other people, that makes us feel good, even if we don't do anything about it. I always marvel when I'm driving through downtown with friends, and they look out and they see people baking on the sidewalk. They talk about how terrible that is, and then they lock the door. And I know they feel good because they feel bad about the people, but they're not going to do anything about that, which is kind of human. So Prufrock spends the end of his poem thinking about what his future is going to be. I shall wear my flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I shall hear the mermaids singing each to each. They do not sing to me for it. We also have to deal with the consequences, whether we act or if we don't. Okay. I'm not sure how to go backwards, but this was going to be your Scrabble word for the day. Schadenfreude. And I didn't realize until I started writing about this that there is an English word, epicaricacy, which means the same thing. I had never seen that word. I love language, and since I've retired, I've been trying to write some verse, and it drives my wife and friends crazy because I play with a lot of language in doing that. So, when we act and we're successful, we always take credit for it, don't we? Sometimes we pretend that other people helped us and we acknowledge other people, but we're very happy to take credit for the success. A psychologist named Paul Piff did a wonderful study with college students and graduate students using Monopoly. Some of you may have heard about this. He would have two students play each other, and he would give one $2,000, 2 dice, and $200 every time he passed go. The other student got $1,000, 1 die, $100 every time he passed go. At the end of the game, and there's no surprise about who won those games, he always quizzed them on why they won. And without fail, every winner said, "It was my skill." It was my skill. We all tend to have that. Of course, Piff went further and decided that the privileged are less ethical, more selfish, more insular, and less compassionate. And this is his quote: "They prioritize their own self-interest above the interest of other people." Now, a group of business faculty decided to write a rebuttal, and the main point of the rebuttal was, well, Paul Piff teaches at the University of Berkeley. What do you expect? Right? What do you expect? But then a professor named Michael Varnum at Arizona State University did a study that involved 58 adults who were higher wealth subjects, and he asked them to list themselves on an empathetic scale. And they all listed themselves as either more or significantly more empathetic than the average person. Then he did brain scans, and he found that neuroscience showed that they had lower than average neural responses when they were faced with people having problems. They seem less empathetic. Neuroscience has taken over academic study, I should tell you. Now, when we so when things go wrong, normally the first thing we think about is who can we blame, right? Who's responsible for that? Second strategy is the system. There's the Nuremberg defense, which is in legal terms called superior orders. I was just following orders. That's why I did it. And then what I came across most of the time with my colleagues was the rules. A good friend of mine believed that all intelligence is on a bell-shaped curve. You all know about the bell-shaped curve. So he always graded on the bell-shaped curve. And I was out one afternoon having a drink with him, and he was telling me about a problem he had with his last exam. The lowest grade out of 100 was a 94. And he said, I hated flunking those kids, the 94. I said, why? He said, well, on the bell-shaped curve, they were at the bottom, so they needed to flunk. And I thought, this is insane. And the classic example of the rules. There's also determinism. It's now generally called epiphenomenalism. That's the denial of free will. We are not making decisions freely. It is a result of biological, chemical, and physical elements within us that force us and push us to do that. The last category, of course, is sociopaths, psychopaths. I don't think I've ever met a psychopath. How would you know? Right? Would you really know that Hannibal Lecter is not just a great physician? I did take a class trial of Ted Bundy. And if Ted Bundy is not a psychopath, I'm not sure the category exists. And listening to him and watching people interact with him was just bizarre. And my wife hates it when I start a sentence like this. When I was in jail, the inmates had a lot of sociopaths among them. Many of them had no idea of right from wrong. I remember one young kid, could have been more than 18, one of the few people there younger than I was, and he was in there for stealing a watch. He went to a jewelry shop and grabbed the watch, it turned out to be a Rolex, and tried to run out, not realizing the door was locked. He was in there, and I talked to him, I asked him, so why'd you do it? He said, well, they had so many watches, and I wanted one. And that was his whole rationale. He wasn't able to get past that on it. So, if we are wrong, we often hurt other people. And this is skipping some, so I'm not sure how to go back. I was there. Okay. And that leads us to apologies. And of course, we all know those faux apologies. You know, I'm sorry, Mary, if you're upset at something I said. And by that, of course, I mean, Mary, you're obviously too thick to understand what I really said. And so I'm sorry for you, I'm not really sorry for myself on that. And those are the apologies that we generally, the politicians, of course, have PhDs and those kinds of faux apologies. Then I realized there's a great reconciliation model, and it's the one developed by my church. Whatever you may think about the Catholic Church, it has spent 2,000 years refining confession. And it has 4 stages, and I'm speaking now on behalf of Bob back there, who is far better Catholic than I am here. And the very first one is we have to think about what we've done. We have to analyze it. We have to see how it is wrong. Next, we have to have repentance. We have to feel that it was wrong. This is the one I find most people fake. Right? I mean, they may understand people think this is wrong, but I don't really feel bad about it. But we have to feel that repentance. Then comes the difficult one. We have to apologize. We have to make the confession. We have to actually say something. And we have to try and make amends. We have to try and right the wrong. Now, there's nothing we can do if people will not take our apologies. We've all been in those situations. Then we just say, I tried, and move on, and not try and stay in that state. But I think that that's just an extraordinary model. And there's a brief period when, like many of the people of my generation, I flirted with Marxism. I thought it would be possible to make kind of Catholic Marxism the way some of the priests in South America were doing it. And I'd go to meetings with groups, and they had self-awareness programs. And I noticed after a while that those self-awareness programs were really just Catholic confession. They're following all 4 of these stages, which you were supposed to, they told you what was wrong, and then you have to try and feel it, and then you have to try and confess, and you have to try and make it up to the group. And it was at that point I thought, if communism is nothing but a secular form of Catholicism, why would I leave my church, right? That doesn't make any sense for it. The next 5 are philosophical. Some of you may have seen this old film, The Barretts of Wimpole Street. Elizabeth Barrett marrying Robert Browning. Elizabeth Barrett's father was a very strange man. He had 8 sons and a couple of daughters. He got tired of naming his sons after the 6th one. So his 7th one was Septimus, and his 8th one was Octavius. Elizabeth was an invalid. No one knew what she was suffering from. Many people today think it was psychosomatic. She relied on what most of the Victorians relied on, opioids. She was a pretty heavy druggie. And one day, a younger, dynamic poet, Robert Browning, came to visit her, and they started flirting, and eventually she ran off with him. And she had to run off with him because her father had told his children that anyone who married would be immediately disowned. And Elizabeth married Browning, and Robert went off. They lived in Europe for a while, had a son. She eventually died, but she published a series of sonnets from the Portuguese. And the most famous of them is How Do I Love Thee? Let me count the ways. And I thought, that makes a lot more sense. Most of us males know that the second worst question we get asked is, why do you love me? The worst question, of course, is, can we talk? I mean, that's always the kiss of death. But why do you love me? And I realize love is so totally irrational that that can't be answered. How do I love thee? Makes far more sense. Love has got to be something more, especially after those first couple of weeks, than just that explosion of passion. C.S. Lewis has a wonderful book on 4 types of love. The first one is Storejet. That's a picture by Diego Rivera. And Lewis describes Storejet as our connection with objects that we feel attached to. Think of Tom Hanks' typewriters, or Roy Rogers' Trigger. Remember when Trigger died, he had him stuffed, kept him in front of the house. Not sure what Dale Evans thought about that, but there was Trigger. They can be places like Susie's Dubstrat, places that we connect with, and parks. They can be pets, Elizabeth's corgis, right? And these are all, Lewis says, ways of providing us with a sense of place, a sense of connection. And they're all critically important to us for it. Oddly enough, he adds the love of parents for their children to this type of love. The second type he talks about is philia. And philia is the connection we have with other people with whom we have a deep bond, lifelong friends, sorority sisters, military units who see themselves as, it used to be bands of brothers, now it's obviously bands of brothers and sisters for it. To C.S. Lewis, philia represents the highest form of human love, but he also believed it was the one that was disappearing. Those connections that people have with each other. Actually, Perry and I were talking about that. The breakdown of connections people have in our world where we connect through the internet on it. The third that we all know is Eros. The early Greeks, incidentally, thought of Eros, the god of love, as one of the original gods coming out of chaos. Over time, he became a child, mostly because of the way many of us behave in love. He was the son of Aphrodite and Ares. And the image of passionate love. The Romans took that even further, as Romans tended to do, and turned him into Cupid, the blind little boy with the bow and arrow. Cupid always reminds me of the kid with a BB gun in the backyard out there, and just firing arrows rapidly also have been trying to find the development of the word cupidity, which in the Renaissance simply meant a deep desire for something, into an unwholesome attachment to money. And my sense is that must have been created by some guy who got dumped by a woman who married somebody richer. And from then on, Cupid was the evil word for him. The fourth is agape, the unselfish love people have for each other, obviously caring, the love of man for God and God for man. I was thinking of early in COVID, Don Giuseppe Baradelli, the Italian priest who caught COVID very early in Italy, and his parishioners bought him a ventilator, and then a boy in the village caught COVID, and the priest gave the boy his ventilator and died. I mean, that's, to me, a classic example of agape. Now, I'm adding a fifth one, Philia. Self-love. Self-love used to be connected with selfishness and vanity. I suspect when most of us were young, we were taught this was bad. Now it's become self-esteem and self-regard, and it's become part of movements like Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ pride, Latino pride. And I think the origin of this comes with Helen Reddy and her song, I Am Woman. I don't know if you remember when it was originally released, the key line was, I can face anything. The next year, it was included in a film and re-released as a single, and she sang, I can do anything. And I think that's a major transformation of it. The next ones, and my wife is looking at her watch, so the next ones I will go through relatively quickly, and most of you are very familiar with them. The first of them is justice. Why do bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people? And we know that that's a critical issue. It's the source of the book of Job, which is probably my single favorite book, which many of my friends think is why I am in some ways so bleak in my outlook on life and loving the book of Job as much as I do. But we have to remember that the word justice comes from the Latin, I'm going to use the church pronunciation, jus juris, jus juris. But that also meant soup, broth, stew, and it's the root of our word juice. And I'm not sure any two people in this room would make a broth in the same way. We all have our individual views of justice, and that's part of what creates difficulty. And just outline the four types of justice. Distributive justice, so allocating resources, obviously taxes. Procedural justice, about fair and transparent processes. Voting is a clear example of procedural justice. Restorative justice, ways offenders can return things, try and make things right. The debate over reparations, which I think will get even bigger. And retributive justice, how do we punish people appropriately? And everything from the drug laws to capital punishment gets into that. Next question is, of course, what is truth? Pilate asking Jesus, what is truth? And I like this because Jesus has clearly been to the gym. right? I mean, he's really ripped on there. And the issue of what truth is became a major point in the Renaissance when people started arguing that there was more than one truth. A former president of Rollins, when I went up to him after a meeting and told him he had misrepresented something, and he needed to tell the faculty the truth, he looked at me and he channeled Pilate and he said, Saki, what is truth? And he walked away. At that point I realized, okay, yeah, I was going to stay out of campus politics for a while. This is John Keats. And in Ode to a Nightingale, he asks, do I wake or sleep? After he believes he sees a nightingale, hears its song, is transported by its song, and then the nightingale disappears, and he wonders if it was really there. Is there an external reality? Rene Descartes, how can I know that I'm not now dreaming? That this is reality. Metamorphosis, of course, deals with that. Shakespeare's Prospero, we are such things, stuff that dreams are made on. Our little life is rounded with the sleep. And of course, the great Humphrey Bogart, Sam Spade, the Maltese Falcons, this stuff dreams are made on. That this comes from there's an Irish bishop, George Barclay, then Berkeley now, who said, no one can know anything external to themselves. We only know the ideas in our head. You can't know me, you know your idea in your head about me. Berkeley was very influential. University of California, Berkeley is named after him, for him. And the last, you'll notice some of these, images from Hamlet, Sarah Bernhardt, John Gielgud, and Judith Anderson, both of whom played Hamlet. Laurence Olivier, Richard Burton. I actually saw Burton in New York. And of course, everything needs a Mel Gibson in it, and Adrian Lester. And the opening line of Hamlet is, who's there? And the whole play is about identity. Do we have a singular identity? In the 19th century, people wanted to find sincerity. In the 20th century, we've become more interested in authenticity. Are we a single person? Or, I should say, am I a single person? Am I multiple people? Am I different people in different environments? And what is the connection among them? And of course, Hamlet, who is seen as the sweet prince, this delicate hero, is responsible for more deaths than almost any other Shakespearean figure. He's just incredibly bloody throughout the play on that. And there's a line from Jailford Prufrock, which Prufrock is talking about the party that he's in. And he says, now I must go and prepare a face to meet the faces that I meet. If you think about that, do we have the same face for everybody we meet? Or do we shift and become something new? So thank you for indulging in that. I bet Daniel, all the glitches were my problem. I gave it to him, but I didn't give him enough good stuff with it.
You'll entertain some questions. I know we've been late. Will you entertain some questions?
I entertain him.
Do you have a favorite philosopher? If you had to choose one, obviously.
Yeah, Plato is obviously
Plato.
somebody you can't go wrong. But by the way, I showed that chart. I think I have it again. I'll put that up so you'll pay attention to me. And this idea of changing, our good friend Julia, sitting all the way in the back, even though much younger than we are, after careers in real estate and cooking and doing lots of interesting things, she just recently became the president of a major corporation. and just something which I don't think she had really expected to do. And it's a wonderful time. And I will put in a plug. One of the things she's been doing is selling off toys that the previous president had. And if you do not have something for Father's Day, she is happy to sell you a Russian make. It's in Ohio, but the Russian make, and she'll negotiate a price with you if you want that perfect Father's Day present.
I have a question. You mentioned Woody Allen when you started out, and when I saw the 10 questions, I was thinking Woody Allen had 10 suggestions that he always referred to. I wonder if those 10 suggestions played any role in your interpretation this morning.
Not with me. I love Woody Allen, which I'm not supposed to say, right? I mean, Woody is on everybody's best list. And I actually taught courses on Woody Allen. One year I taught a course on Woody Allen, and I looked around the class. It was during an intersession we had, 3-week period, intensive class. And I looked around, and there were 10 males, 10 females. I looked at the guys a couple of times, and I thought, there's something weird. Then I realized what it was. All 10 of these guys were great-looking guys. And I thought, why are they taking a course in Woody Allen? I thought Woody Allen killed people who look like me. And over the course of the term, brief term, I sat down with each student to talk about it, and all the guys had the same answer. And that answer of why they took the course was, we always feel like Woody Allen. Absolutely shocked me on that. So I think there's a little Woody Allen in everybody. The good Woody Allen, sorry. The good Woody Allen.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like us all to, in addition to thanking Saki, thank George for his wonderful lunch that he presented to us.
Thank you all. Thank you, University Club.